All right, so right now we're going to take a look at Chapter 2 of Freakonomics. How is the Ku Klux Klan like a group of real estate agents? I'm going to read this. We're going to bounce back and forth to the questions that I already have set up in a Google Doc. Okay, so that way we can really understand what is going on in the book. Chapter 2. As institutions go, the Ku Klux Klan had a markedly up and down history. It was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War by 6 Confederate soldiers in Pulaski, Tennessee. The 6 young men, 4 of whom were budding lawyers, saw themselves as merely a circle of like-minded friends. Thus the name they chose, Ku Klux, a slight mangling of kuklos, the Greek word for circle. In the beginning, their activities were said to be harmless midnight pranks. For instance, riding horses through the countryside while draped in white sheets and pillowcase hoods. But soon the Klan evolved into a multi-state terrorist organization designed to frighten and kill emancipated slaves. Among its regional leaders were 5 former Confederate generals. Its staunchest supporters were the plantation owners, for whom Reconstruction posed an economic and political nightmare. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant spelled out for the House of Representatives the true aims of the Ku Klux Klan. By force and terror, to prevent all political action not in accord with the views of the members, to deprive colored citizens of the right to bear arms and the right of a free ballot, to suppress the schools in which colored children were taught, and reduce the colored to a condition closely allied to that of slavery. The entire Klan did its work through pamphleteering, lynching, shooting, burning, castrating, pistol whipping, and 1,000 forms of intimidation. They targeted former slaves and any whites who supported the blacks' rights to vote, acquire land, or gain an education. But within barely a decade, the Klan had been extinguished, largely by legal and military interventions out of Washington, D.C. If the Klan itself was defeated, however, its aims had largely been achieved through the establishment of Jim Crow laws. Congress, which during Reconstruction had been quick to enact measures of legal, social, and economic freedom for blacks, just as quickly began to roll them back. So they gave them the rights and then they took them back. The federal government agreed to withdraw its occupation troops from the South, allowing the restoration of white rule. In Plessy v. Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court gave the go-ahead to full-scale racial segregation. So remember, Plessy v. Ferguson is the one that made separate but equal legal. The Ku Klux Klan lay largely dormant until 1915, when D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, originally titled The Klansman, helped to spark its rebirth. Griffith presented the Klan as crusaders for white civilization itself and as one of the noblest forces in American history. The film quoted a line from A History of the American People, written by a renowned historian. At last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country. The historian in question was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, one-time scholar and president of Princeton University. By the 1920s, a revived Klan claimed 8 million members. This time around, the Klan was not confined to the South, but ranged throughout the country. This time, it concerned itself not only with blacks, but also with Catholics, Jews, communists, unionists, immigrants, agitators, and other disruptors of the status quo. In 1933, with Hitler ascendant in Germany, Will Rogers was the first to draw a line between the new Klan and the new threat in Europe. Papers all state Hitler is trying to copy Mussolini, he wrote. Looks to me, it's like the Ku Klux that he's copying. The onset of World War II and a number of internal scandals once again laid the Klan low. Public sentiment turned against the Klan as the unity of a country at war triumphed its message of separatism. But within a few years, there were already signs of a massive revival. As wartime anxiety gave way to post-war uncertainty, Klan membership flourished. Barely 2 months after VJ Day, the Klan in Atlanta burned a 300-foot cross on the face of Stone Mountain, site of a storied rock carving of Robert E. Lee. The extravagant cross burning, one Klansman later said, was intended just to let the N-word know that the war is over and the Klan is back on the market. Atlanta had by now become Klan headquarters. The Klan was thought to hold great sway with key Georgia politicians, and its Georgia chapters were said to include many policemen and sheriff's deputies. Yes, the Klan was a secret society reveling in passwords and cloak and dagger ploys, but its real power lay in the very public fear that it fostered, exemplified by the open secret that the Ku Klux Klan and the law enforcement establishment were brothers in arms. Atlanta, the imperial city of the KKK's invisible empire and Klan jargon, was also home to Stetson Kennedy, a 30-year-old man with the bloodlines of a Klansman but a temperament that ran opposite. He came from a good Southern family which claimed ancestors including 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence, an officer in the Confederate Army, and John B. Stetson, founder of the famed hat company and the man for whom Stetson University was named. Oops. Sorry, there, lost my place. Stetson Kennedy grew up in a 14-room house in Jacksonville, Florida, the youngest of 5 children. His uncle Brady was a Klansman. Kennedy would go on to become a self-described dissident at large, writing numberless articles and several books that rallied against bigotry. He first worked as a folklorist, traveling around Florida to collect old native tales and songs. Years later, when he served as a rare white correspondent for the Pittsburgh Courier, the country's largest black newspaper, he wrote under the pseudonym Daddy Mention, after a black folk hero who, as myth told it, could outrun the blast of a sheriff's shotgun. What drove Kennedy was a hatred of small-mindedness, ignorance, obstructionism, and intimidation, which, in his view, were displayed by no organization more proudly than the Ku Klux Klan. Kennedy saw the Klan as a terrorist aim of the white establishment itself. This struck him as an intractable problem for a variety of reasons. The Klan was in cahoots with political, business, and law enforcement leaders. The public was frightened and felt powerless to act against the Klan, and the few anti-hate groups that existed at the time had little leverage or even information about the Klan. Almost all the things written on the subject were editorials, not exposés, Kennedy would later explain. The writers were against the Klan, all right, but they had precious few inside facts about it. Okay, so I just want to make sure we know what question we're answering. So we're answering, what does Stetson Kennedy learn about the Ku Klux Klan, and how does he learn this information? So this is where we're going to figure that out. So Kennedy set out to gather those facts. He would spend years interviewing Klan leaders and sympathizers, sometimes taking advantage of his own background and lineage to pretend that he was on their side of the issues. He also attended public Klan events, and as he would later write, he even set about to infiltrate the Klan in Atlanta. So infiltrate means to kind of get inside, so getting into the Klan in Atlanta. The Klan Unmasked, Kennedy's memoir of his exploits inside the Klan, is in fact more of a novelization than a straight nonfiction account. Kennedy, a folklorist at heart, apparently wanted to put across the most dramatic story possible, and therefore included not only his own anti-Klan activities, but those of another man, codenamed John Brown. Brown was a union worker and a former Klan official who had changed his ways and offered to infiltrate the Klan. It was John Brown who apparently performed many of the most dramatic and dangerous episodes portrayed in The Klan Unmasked, physically attending Klan meetings and other functions in Atlanta. But since Stetson Kennedy was the man who later wrote the book, he rendered Brown's actions as his own. Regardless, there was a great deal of information to be gleaned from this Brown-Kennedy collaboration. Brown divulged what he was learning at the weekly Klan meetings, the identity of the Klan's local and religious leaders, their upcoming plans, the Klan's current rituals, passwords, and language. It was Klan custom, for instance, to append a KL to many words, so thus 2 Klansmen would hold a conversation at the local clavern. The secret Klan handshake was a left-handed, limp-wristed fish wiggle. When a traveling Klansman wanted to locate brethren in a strange town, he would ask for a Mr. Ayak, being code for, "Are you a Klansman?" He would hope to hear the response, "Yes, and I also know a Mr. Akai, code for, "A Klansman am I." Before long, John Brown was invited to join the Cavaliers. the Klan's secret police and flog squad. For an infiltrator, this posed a particularly sticky problem. What would happen if he was called upon to inflict violence? But as it happened, a central tenet in the life of the Klan and terrorism in general is that most of the threat and violence never goes beyond the threat stage. So I'm just going to stop here for right now, and we're going to look back at this question. So what does Stetson Kennedy learn about the Ku Klux Klan? And how does he learn this information? So we learned that Kennedy infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan. So when we talk about infiltrating something, it means he kind of got involved with it. Okay. So he infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan, and then he started to learn some of their rituals. So Stetson Kennedy infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan and pretended to be one of their members. Okay. He learned that many of the KKK members were part of government and law enforcement. And he also learned a lot of their rituals and habits, like their handshakes and the ways they would find each other. Okay. So now we're looking for what's the best idea Kennedy came up with to fight the Klan. So we're going to look at that. So they talked about how most of the threat and violence never goes beyond the threat stage. So consider lynching, the Klan's hallmark sign of violence. Here, compiled by the Tuskegee Institute, are the decade-by-decade statistics on the lynching of blacks in the United States. Bear in mind that these figures represent not only lynchings attributed to the Ku Klux Klan, but the total number of reported lynchings. The statistics reveal at least three noteworthy facts. The first is the obvious decrease in lynchings over time. So if you look at 1890, there's 1,111 lynchings. Down to the 1960s, there's 3. The second is the absence of a correlation between lynchings and Klan membership. There were actually more lynchings of blacks between 1900 and 1909, when the Klan was dormant, than during the 1920s, when the Klan had millions of members, which suggests that the Ku Klux Klan carried out far fewer lynchings than is generally thought. Third, relative to the size of the black population, lynchings were exceedingly rare. To be sure, one lynching is too many lynchings, but by the turn of the century, lynchings were hardly the everyday occurrence that they're often considered in the public recollection. Compare the 281 victims of lynching in 1920s to the number of black infants who were dying at the time as a result of malnutrition, pneumonia, diarrhea, and the like. As of 1920, about 13 of every 100 black children died in infancy, or roughly 20,000 children each year, compared to 28 people who were lynched in a year. As late as 1940, about 10,000 black infants died each year. What larger truths do these lynching figures suggest? What does it mean that lynchings were relatively rare and that they fell precipitously over time, even in the face of a boom in Klan membership? The most compelling explanation is that all those early lynchings worked. White racists, whether or not they belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, had through their actions and their rhetoric, developed a strong incentive scheme that was terribly clear and terribly frightening. If a black person violated the accepted code of behavior, whether by talking back to a bus driver or daring to try to vote, he knew he might well be punished, perhaps by death. So it may be by the mid-1940s, when Stetson Kennedy was trying to bust up the Klan, that it didn't really need to use as much violence. Many blacks, having long been told to behave like second-class citizens, or else simply obliged. 1 or 2 lynchings went a long way to inducing docility, or maybe among even a large group of people, for people to respond strongly to strong incentives. And there are few incentives more powerful than the fear of random violence, which in existence is why terrorism is so effective. But if the Ku Klux Klan of the 1940s wasn't uniformly violent, what was it? The Klan that Stetson Kennedy wrote about was, in fact, a sorry fraternity of men, most of them poorly educated, with poor prospects, who needed a place to vent and an excuse for occasionally staying out all night. That their fraternity engaged in quasi-religious chanting and oath-taking and hosanna-hailing, all of it top secret, made it that much more appealing. Kennedy also found the Klan to be a slick money-making operation, at least for those near the top of the organization. Klan leaders had any number of revenue sources, thousands of dues-paying rank-and-file members, business owners who hired the Klan to scare off unions, or who paid the Klan protection money, Klan rallies that generated huge cash donations, even the occasional gun running or moonshine operation. Then there were rackets like the Klan's Death Benefits Association, which sold insurance policies to Klan members and accepted only cash or personal checks made out to the Grand Dragon himself. And even though the Klan may not have been as deadly as generally thought, it was plenty violent, and perhaps worse, had ever greater designs on political influence. Kennedy was therefore eager to damage the Klan in any way that he could. When he heard about Klan plans for a union-busting rally, he fed the information to a Union friend. He passed along Klan information after the Assistant Attorney General of Georgia had established Klan Buster. After researching the Klan's corporate charter, Kennedy wrote to the governor of Georgia, suggesting the grounds upon which the chapter should be revoked. The Klan had been designated a non-profit, a non-political organization, but Kennedy had proof that it was clearly devoted to both profits and politics. The problem is that most of Kennedy's efforts weren't producing the desired effect. The Klan was so entrenched and broad-based that Kennedy felt as if he was tossing pebbles at a giant. And even if he could somehow damage the Klan in Atlanta, the hundreds of other chapters around the country would go untouched. So Kennedy was extremely frustrated, and out of this frustration was born a new strategy. He had noticed one day a group of young boys playing some kind of spy game in which they exchanged silly secret passwords. It reminded him of the Klan. Wouldn't it be nice, he thought, to get the Klan's passwords and the rest of the secrets into the hands of kids all across the country, and their parents, too? What a better way to defang a secret society than to make public its most secret information? Instead of futilely attacking the Klan from the outside, what if he could somehow unleash all the secret inside information that John Brown was gathering from the Klan's weekly meetings? Between Brown's inside dope and everything that Kennedy had learned via his own investigations, he probably knew more Klan secrets than the average Klansman. Kennedy turned to the most powerful mass medium of his day, radio. He began feeding Klan reports to the journalist Drew Pearson, whose Washington Merry-Go-Round program was heard by millions of adults every day, and to the producers of The Adventures of Superman show, which reached millions of children each night. He told them about Mr. Iac and Mr. Akai, and he passed along overheated passages from the Klan's Bible, which was called the Quran. Kennedy never did learn why a white Christian supremacist group would give its Bible essentially the same name as the most holy book of Islam, which is the Quran. He explained that the role of the Klan officers in any local clavern, the caliph, vice president, the clockard, the lecturer, clud, chaplain, cligrap, secretary, claby, treasurer, clad, conductor, clarago, inner guard, Clexter, outer guard, and the Clocan, 5-man investigative committee, and the Clavaliers, whose leader was called the Chief Ass Terror. He spelled out the Klan hierarchy as it proceeded from the local to the national level. An exalted Cyclops and his 12 terrors, a giant Titan and his 12 furies, a grand dragon and his 9 hydras, and the Imperial Wizard and his 15 genii. As Kennedy passed along all the information and gossip that John Brown gleaned from infiltrating the Maine Klan chapter, Nathan Bedford Forrest Claver No. 1, Atlanta, Realm of Georgia. During the war, the Adventures of Superman program had portrayed its hero fighting Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito, but now it was in need of fresh villains. The Klan was the perfect target, and Superman turned his powers against them. Drew Pearson, an avowed Klan hater, now began giving regular Klan updates on his radio show, and then gave further updates based on John Brown's inside reports to show how the original updates were infuriating Klan officials. Pearson's work created an echo chamber that seemed to be driving Grand Dragon Samuel Green crazy. Here is Pearson's radio excerpt from November 17th, 1948. Speaking at Claver No. 1, Atlanta, Georgia, the week after elections, the Grand Dragon wrung his hands and once again cautioned Klansmen to be careful about leaks. I have to talk frankly at these meetings, he said, but I might as well call Drew Pearson before I come to the next meeting and give him the information for the next day. He gives it out to everybody from coast to coast. The AP and UP are both calling me about it next morning while I am eating breakfast. Grand Dragon spoke about plans for a big cross burning to be held in Macon, Georgia on December 10th. It would be the biggest in Klan history, he said, and he expected 10,000 Klansmen to be there in their robes. He added that the Cavalier Club, the Klan's whipping and flogging department, was now on the job and had plenty of friends on the Atlanta police force. As the Pearson and Superman radio shows played on, and as Stetson and Kennedy continued to relay Klan secrets obtained by John Brown to other broadcast and print outlets, a funny thing happened. Attendance at Klan meetings began to fall, as did applications for new membership. Of all the ideas that Kennedy had thought up to fight off bigotry, this campaign was easily the cleverest. He turned the Klan's secrecy against itself by making its private information public. He converted heretofore precious knowledge into ammunition for mockery. Okay, so what's the best idea that he came up with to fight the Klan? Okay, so he shared information about their secrets with local radio shows and the children's radio show, The Adventures of Superman. This meant that this information was no longer secret. And the KKK felt like they were being watched. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit here because now we've got kind of that background information about the KKK. All right. So I'm actually going to go to for you, it's page 63. See if it's also 63 on here. Let me find it. Well, for you, it's page 63. Oh, you can turn to that. But I have to find it. Okay, on here it's 60. All right, so we're going to look down to where it talks about information. Information is a beacon, a cudgel, an olive branch, a deterrent, all depending on who wields it and how. Information is so powerful that the assumption of information, even if the information does not actually exist, can have a sobering effect. Consider the case of a one-day-old car. Okay, so we're looking back here, and it says, use the same word to fill in the blanks. The authors state that blank is so powerful, information is so powerful, that the assumption of information, even if the information does not actually exist, can have a sobering effect. Okay. So now we're looking for the question of the chapter. How are real estate agents like the KKK? A lot of this is talking about cars. So I'm going to go, again, for you it's page 70. Let's find out what it is for me. All right. So for you it's page 70. We're going to start on, so the big part of a real estate agent's job, it would seem. So the big part of a real estate agent's job, it would seem, is to persuade the homeowner to sell for less than he would like, while at the same time letting potential buyers know that a house can be bought for less than its listing price. Sorry. To be sure, there are more subtle means of doing so than coming right out and telling the buyer to bid low. The study of real estate agents cited above also includes data to reveal how agents convey information through the for sale ads that they write. A phrase like well-maintained, for instance, is as full of meaning to an agent as Mr. Iac was to a Klansman. It means that a house is old but not quite falling down. A savvy buyer will know this and find out for himself once he sees the house. But to the 65-year-old retiree who's selling his house, well-maintained might sound like a compliment, which is just what the seller intends. An analysis of the language used in real estate ads shows that certain words are powerfully correlated with the final sale price of a house. This doesn't necessarily mean that labeling a house well-maintained causes it to sell for less than an equivalent house. It does, however, indicate that when a real estate agent labels a house well-maintained, she might be subtly encouraging a buyer to bid low. Listed below are 10 terms commonly used in real estate ads. 5 of them have a strong positive correlation to the ultimate sale price, and 5 have a strong negative correlation. Find out which are which. Okay, so we have, or guess which are which. We have fantastic, granite, spacious, state of the art, exclamation point, Korean, charming, maple, great neighborhood, gourmet. A fantastic house is surely fantastic enough to warrant a high price, isn't it? What about a charming and a spacious house in a great neighborhood? No, no, and no. Here's the breakdown. Okay, high selling price, granite, state-of-the-art, Korean, maple, or gourmet. 5 terms with a lower sale price, fantastic, spacious, exclamation point, charming, great neighborhood. 3 of the 5 terms correlated with a higher sale price are physical descriptions of the house itself, granite, Korean, and maple. As information goes, such terms are specific and straightforward and therefore pretty useful. If you like granite, you might like this house, but even if you don't, granite doesn't connote a fixer-upper, nor does gourmet or state-of-the-art, both of which seem to tell a buyer that a house is on some level truly fantastic. Okay. So we can say that real estate agents and the KKK are similar in that both groups of people use language to make the people that they are speaking to think a certain way. They also will sometimes withhold information to preserve their power, and they won't tell prospective buyers of all the problems a house may have or the negatives. Okay, they're trying to benefit themselves for personal profit and gain.
Okay, so then it starts. I'll give you another second on this one. You can always go back and pause. So then it starts to talk about all these different words. Okay. And it talks about a real estate agent. So it says, if you study the words in an ad for a real estate agent's own home, meanwhile, you see that she indeed emphasizes the descriptive terms, especially new, granite, maple, moving condition, and avoids empty adjectives, including wonderful, immaculate, and the telltale exclamation point. Then she patiently waits for the best buyer to come along. She might tell this buyer about a house nearby that just sold for $25,000 above the asking price, or another house that is currently the subject of a bidding war. She is careful to exercise every advantage of this information as asymmetry as she enjoys. Does this make her a bad person? That's hard to say, at least hard for us to say. The point here is that real estate agents is not that real estate agents are bad people, but that they simply are people. And people inevitably respond to incentives. The incentive to the real estate business, as currently configured, plainly encourages some agents to act against the best interests of the customers. Okay. All right. So now we're going to look down. And we're going to skip quite a bit ahead. We're looking for some information about The Weakest Link, the TV show The Weakest Link. Okay. All right, so we're going to go down. For you, it's page 74. All right, for me, it's 70. Even if you are a private citizen, you surely wouldn't want to seem bigoted when appearing in public. Might there be a way to test for discrimination in a public setting? Unlikely as it may seem, the television show The Weakest Link provides a unique laboratory to study discrimination. This was on a while ago, so you guys probably don't remember this show. An import from the United Kingdom, The Weakest Link for a short time became wildly popular in the US. The game includes 8 contestants, or in a later daytime version, 6, who each answer trivia questions and compete for a single cash jackpot. But the player who answers the most questions correctly isn't necessarily the player who advances. After each round, every contestant votes to eliminate one other contestant. A player's trivia answering ability is presumably the only worthwhile factor to consider. Race, gender, and age wouldn't seem to matter, but do they? By measuring a contestant's actual votes against the votes that would truly serve his best interests, it's possible to tell if discrimination is at play. Sorry. The voting strategy changes as the game progresses. In the first several rounds, it makes sense to eliminate bad players since the jackpot grows only when the correct answers are given. In later rounds, the strategic incentives are flipped. The value of building the jackpot is now outweighed by each contestant's desire to win the jackpot. It's easier to do that if you eliminate the other good players. So, roughly speaking, the typical contestant will vote to eliminate the worst players in the early rounds and the better players in the late rounds. The key to measuring the weakest link voting data is to tease out a contestant's playing ability from his race, gender, and age. If a young black man answers a lot of questions correctly but is voted off early, discrimination would seem to be a factor. Meanwhile, if an elderly white woman doesn't answer a single question correctly and is still not voted off, some sort of discriminatory favoritism would seem to be at play. Again, let's keep in mind that all this is happening on camera. And the contestant knows that his friends, family, and coworkers, along with a few million strangers, are watching. So who, if anyone, is discriminated against on the weakest link? Not, as it turns out, blacks. An analysis of more than 160 episodes reveals that black contestants in both the early and late rounds of the game are eliminated at a rate commensurate with their trivia answering abilities. The same is true for female contestants. In a way, neither of these findings is so surprising. Two of the most potent political campaigns of the past half century were the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, which demonized discrimination against blacks and women respectively. So perhaps, you say hopefully, discrimination was practically eradicated during the 20th century. Like polio. Or more likely, it has just become so unfashionable to discriminate against certain people that all but the most insensitive people take pains to appear fair-minded, at least in public. This hardly means that discrimination itself has ended, only that people are embarrassed to show it. How might you determine whether the lack of discrimination against blacks and women represents a true absence or just a charade? The answer can be found by looking at other groups that society doesn't protect as well. Indeed, the weakest link voting data do indicate two types of contestants who are consistently discriminated against. Sorry. The elderly and Latinos. Among economists, there are two leading theories of discrimination. Interestingly, elderly weakest link contestants seem to suffer from one type, while Latinos suffer the other. The first type is called taste-based discrimination, which means that one person discriminates simply because he prefers not to interact with a particular type of other person. In the second type, known as information-based discrimination, one person believes that another type of person has poor skills and acts accordingly. On the weakest link, Latinos suffer information-based discrimination. The other contestants seem to view the Latinos as poor players, even when they are not. This perception translates into Latinos being eliminated in early rounds even if they are doing well, and not being eliminated in the later rounds when contestants want to keep the Latinos around to weaken the field. Elderly players, meanwhile, are victims of taste-based discrimination. In the early rounds and late rounds, they are eliminated far out of proportion to their skills. It seems as if the other contestants, this is a show on which the average age is 34, simply don't want older players around. It's quite possible that the typical weakest link contestant isn't even cognizant of his discrimination toward Latino and the elderly. Or, in the case of blacks and women, his lack of discrimination. He's bound to be nervous, after all, and excited playing a fast-moving game under the glare of television lights, which naturally suggests another question. How might the same person express his preferences and reveal information about himself in the privacy of his own home? So looking back at the question, it says, how does the information-based discrimination and taste-based discrimination play out on the game show The Weakest Link? So we know that contestants didn't typically discriminate against women and black contestants. However, they showed let me just make sure I'm correct here. Information-based discrimination against Latinos by eliminating them in the early rounds of the show, even if they were doing well. They also eliminated elderly contestants early on because they might not have wanted them around. Which is an example of taste-based discrimination. So if you need that information, go ahead and pause that there so you can finish that up. Okay, so I'm going to stop here just because we finished the questions from this chapter, but there is in the next few pages some information about like statistics around dating sites, which is actually pretty interesting. So if that's something that interests you, I suggest that you go ahead and take a look at that.